We've got some more people coming in. Let's get started on this one. We've got a bona fide Curtis Trent hand there. Yes, welcome. Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people here. Before I say anything more about this, I just want to make one tiny announcement on this one, if the thing will show me. I don't know if anybody here knows the actor Joss Ackland or knows of him. Absolutely legendary film and TV actor who was the voice of Peter Van Eckhart, the main villain of The Angel of Darkness 20 years ago. So he unfortunately passed away very recently. I think it was the 19th, wasn't it? Something very recent. So I just wanted to make a very quick mention of that and how much we all owe Joss for bringing this incredible villain to life with so much charisma and so much wonderful dialogue that you wrote and that you acted alongside Eric. It would not have been the same without him. So thank you, Josh, so much for that. Okay, let's have a look. Before we get going, I have a question. What were you doing when you were 10 years old? Because I was buying this. This is Doom 2, Hell on Earth, the novel. And I bought this when I was 10 years old in Waterstones in a very cold, wet day in Nottingham. And it blew my mind. It changed my life. Because up until that point, video games in the 90s were, if you were very lucky, you would get a little leaflet inside the physical disc sleeve with a very, very bare bones plot attached to it, along the lines of, Earth is being invaded by demons. It's up to you to stop them. It never occurred to me until that moment that a video game narrative, even one as tiny and flimsy as that, could be turned into a prose with the characters fully fleshed out, with more depth to the environments and the emotions and the actions than you could ever fit into a video game. So I hope that this talk, however brief it is, will give you an inkling of what it would take to transfer a video game narrative into another format, in this case, the novel. My name is Jennifer Milward, or Jenni Milward, if you happen to know me and I don't owe you money. And I been a Tomb Raider fan for about 24 years now. Thank you, Murty, for plugging my books earlier, because my biggest question has always been Tomb Raider. And a few years ago, I novelised the Angel of Darkness game. And I'm in the process of writing the sequels. The first one, Half of the Black Alchemist, I released in July. All of these are available for free on my website, so if you want to see what I did with the story, please be my guest and go ahead. But this isn't about me, this is about you guys, because a lot of you people will be either video game lovers or be actively in the process of learning how video games are made with a view to making your own. So I really hope by the end of this talk, you will have some better idea of what that process actually involves. So by the end of it, I hope that you'll have the advantages and the disadvantages of novelising a video game, because there are lots of both. Come on. Let's be having you. No. You can tell I'm not good with tech, aren't you? Come on. Thank you. The factors you need to consider while you're adapting, because it's not a simple case of just transcribing something from what you're playing. Why some genres are way easier to make the divide and the crossover than others. Some do it beautifully, some need a bit more work. The factors you need to consider when you choose your avatar protagonist. And I'll explain a bit more about why I say avatar protagonist instead of just protagonist in a little while. And finally, why stories are important in the first place to video games and to novels and to any other media that you might happen to come across. Also, fair warning, I sometimes need to sit down for 5 minutes because I don't have great legs, so bear with me on that one. So after I've got a quick wet and whistle, let's dive right in. And let's get the bad news out of the way first. Let's have a look at the disadvantages. When it lets me. Why would you find it difficult to do it? The first big one is that your game narrative would need to be adapted to a novel. Sounds simple. It really isn't. Games have their own rules, novels have theirs. And if you try to treat one like it just fits into the other, you're onto a losing game before you even start. Next, games are interactive in a way that novels aren't. Sounds obvious. You know, when you are playing a game, you are interacting with the story and the characters and the environment in a way that you just don't do when you are passively absorbing text from a book. But doesn't mean that one is bad and one is other way. The other one, oh God, this one. Your novel would have to chime with the game's continuity. I'm rolling my eyes here because I have read video game novelizations that completely ignore the continuity of the games that they are claiming to adapt. It is so painfully obvious when you are already a fan of that franchise. So it's made me put down books in the past because I know that the author hasn't done a good job, that their heart wasn't really in it. They weren't making the effort. So that's another thing you've got to do. And of course, the obvious, it costs money. Why does it cost money to do this? Well, you're going to need quite a few things. First of all, you're going to need a decent writer, editor, proofreader, everybody who is involved in the machinery of getting a very solid product book out on sale. You don't want to be putting out a messy first draft or anything that's poorly proofread, nothing that's properly typeset. It's just going to be a mess. You also, if you are thinking of doing it as a physical media, you will need somebody or some organisation that can print and bind it for you. That's another extra cost you've got to consider. If you do ebooks, of course, you don't have to worry about that. And of course, publishing. How are you going to get this out? How are you going to distribute it? How are you going to market it? Because even people who play the game religiously might not know that you've decided to adapt it. You're going to have to tell them somehow. And of course, these days, audiobooks are even more popular than ever. Everybody loves a good audiobook that they can listen to in the gym, while they walk the dog, while they're on the train. That is another avenue to explore, but that comes with its own set of costs, including voice actors, recording studios, engineers, all the technical people that you will need to bring this audiobook to life, let alone adapt the audiobook from the novel. Some people do abridged versions, which is all very useful sometimes. Other times you want the complete cover to cover. All of these things will cost you money, cost you time, cost you effort. So why do it in the first place? Let's look at why you really want to consider doing this. First, you'll do exactly what happened to me when I was 10 years old in that Waterstones shop. I had no idea that these things were a thing until I looked at the science fiction section in my Waterstones studio and went, ooh, that looks interesting. And I'd already played the game. My dad and I played the Doom games, Spear of Destiny, Wolfenstein 3D, Quake, all these very early ones that quite a few people here are way too young to remember. But a lot of people who go in that bookshop will not be gamers, but they might be intrigued by your story. So you can broaden the appeal to somebody who would not necessarily have twigged your very first game that this is all based on. What else? As a corollary to that, you grow your franchise through the power of transmedia. When you open it up to novels, you are also opening up to audiobooks, to comics, to graphic novels, to film, to TV. You don't know where your franchise is going to go. So if you create a really good IP, a really good story, you don't need to limit it to video games. And why should you? Makes you money. Also, this is a subtle one, but you can tell stories that aren't actually possible just through video games. Excuse me a moment. Now, that's not to say that that this is like some stories belong in video games and some belong in novels and never the two should meet. No, what I mean is you can tell your story in a different way that you would be limited to if you were purely relying on an audio-visual interactive situation with that. Because what you are interacting with when you create a novel is the reader's imagination. And that is not ever constrained by how fast your graphics card is, how good your sound system is. So you can get into the heads and the hearts of your characters in a way that you can't just by seeing what they do on the outside. Another advantage is you can expand the lore and the world building. So many video games have got the most incredible background and story to them. Literally pages and pages worth. You know, you could be playing this particular franchise for years, and some people do, and still not explore all of it. And novels are a great way to expand on that. You might hear a reference to an event that took place deep in the dark, distant past of your wonderful fantasy genre video game. But with a novel, you'd be able to tell that story without having the enormous cost of actually producing that as a AAA game, which is a big factor. Another thing, you can increase the empathy and the connection to your avatar protagonist through novels. In a video game, we only hear and see what's on the outside of a character. But in a novel, you have the power to get into their heads and hear what they're thinking, feel what they're feeling, that they don't necessarily view to the world. It can be done in video games. Please take everything I'm saying with a humongous pinch of salt, because a lot of the times when I say, well, this is hard, doesn't mean it's impossible. And this is such an important one. You will not have studio executives breathing down your neck saying, you know, that really powerful emotional moment, that key moment in this protagonist's character arc when she makes this really big decision and it has a huge impact on where a character is going. Yeah, we need her to shoot 15,000 dragons straight after she's done this. And this is actually illustrated in a beautiful case study. We call this narrative dissonance, where the game demands the mechanics of shooting things and finding things to say one thing of your character, but the story is demanding something else. Now, this happened very infamously in Tomb Raider 2013, the reboot by Rhianna Pratchett. This is her being interviewed by Steve War last October. In Tomb Raider, Lara Croft's very first kill, the very first time she ever kills another human being, is a case of self-defense. And it's a very traumatic moment, as you would expect, for this, inexperienced, very young, fresh out of university girl. And it leaves its mark. Now, Rhianna Pratchett, the writer who was drafted in for this, she wanted Lara to throw the gun away immediately after killing this person. Yes, it was in self-defense, but she was so horrified by what she'd done and forced to do that she throws the gun away. And yeah, I don't want to be this person. I don't want to do this thing. And then later, a little way further down the line, she would be forced to choose to pick up a weapon and kill again, this time to help her friends. Again, in a life-threatening situation, but she would make that choice. Unfortunately, the developers said, yeah, that's really great, but we need her to kill 34 people immediately after, because she's escaping all this burning village and everything. Pratchett managed to talk them down to 16, which is an improvement, but it killed the drama of that moment. It absolutely undermined what they were trying to say about that character's development and the arc that she was going through. At that point in the story, going from, woe is me, I've killed a man, to, I'm coming for you all, you bastards. That was a bit tough to swallow. So yeah, nobody in the Tomb Raider fandom really understands why that happened, except it was studio development. And you would not need to worry about that if you were novelising it, because you could do it some other way. You don't have to put in gameplay. You don't have to have her kill somebody in that moment if she has another way of doing it. You can explain what exactly is going on in her head in a way that feels natural. So come on, let's move this on when the controls will let me. Okay, process of adaptation. I'm going to move through this a little bit more briskly because I know that we're losing time on this one, and I'm hoping that if there's anybody who has questions afterwards, we have the time to do that. If you're going to adapt your video game narrative into a novel, you need to be aware of several things. The most important one, I cannot stress this enough, adaptation does not equal transcription of the game. If you sit down, play a game, and you've got a notepad next to you and say, protagonist kills 15 dragons, scales a cliff, picks up hidden treasure chest, kills another 5 Vikings, has a talk with someone. It gets so boring. I recently read an adaptation of God of War that basically did exactly that, and I gave up after about 20 pages. It wasn't taking advantage of the uniqueness of the novel's format and the opportunities that it offers to get beyond the linear, get beyond the simple, he did this, he did that, he did the other. Story structure is so important, and it's very often overlooked. People think when you talk about story structure, you know, what the acts are, what happens in each part, they think that you say that you're making an analysis of something that you've already created, when actually you need to create the structure first and then build your narrative on top of that. So that ties in very closely with this and with the adaptation process. You will need to understand there is a difference between plot and narrative. Plot is simply what happens. If you want to bake a cake, you will need eggs, flour, butter, sugar, etc. That's the what, that's the plot. But narrative is the story and how you tell it. If I wanted to make a cake, then the narrative might have me first start out by washing the dishes. Oh, that was a very good cake I just made. I'm looking forward to it coming out of the oven. But then you could go back, you could go forward, you can go anywhere you want with the narrative. The plot stays the same, but the narrative is how you tell it, and you must understand this process and this distinction if you're going to actually successfully adapt something. Another thing you need to remember and bear in mind when it will let me. Hello? Hello? Thank you. Tied in with this is character arcs. If story structure is the overarching story, character arcs is the overarching spine of what an individual character will go through and what their process of evolution and change will be. Some, like, Lara Croft in 2013, will start off as a inexperienced, fresh-faced university graduate, going on her first adventure, and she will end it a changed person. So that's her arc throughout the story that you're charting. You will also need to have... Why are you not behaving yourself? You're just trying to embarrass me. Yeah. Again, video games are audiovisual. You interact with them through what you can see and what you can hear. But when you adapt it into a novel, you can engage every single sense, every emotion. Hot, cold, wet, dry, happy, sad, on the fence. Who knows? But every single part of the human experience is available to novels in a more immersive way than just seeing it or hearing it can be. That's not to take away from video games. That can be an incredibly immersive process as well. But again, the imagination is the highest spec gaming console that will ever exist, let alone that will ever be in our price range. So, before we move on to the next one, dialogue. As you said briefly in your talk, Murty, a few minutes ago, dialogue is so important to get right and to understand the process it takes in the wider story structure. Dialogue is not something you sprinkle on the cake afterwards like frosting or decoration. Dialogue is a fundamental way to reflect both the story structure and the character arcs. So, Robert McKee, famous screenwriter and guru, he wrote a book about this thick on story. And then a few years later, he wrote one equally thick just on dialogue. So it's a very detailed subject in its own right. I don't have time to go into that right now, but if you are serious about writing, dialogue needs to be treated with absolute respect because it is an art form all by itself with its own rules that must be obeyed if it's going to work. Okay, so let's move on to genre, or at least we will move on now. I've had a quick. Oh, that's better. Actually talk without sounding like a whistle. Okay, so video games come in lots of different flavours and genres, just like novels, just like all media do. Why is it then that some are much easier to novelise than others? Let's have a look. The easy genres to make the crossover are those where there is interactivity. Video games require you to do things, to pick up items, to kill bad guys. There is an interactive element to it that you can easily portray in a novel format. However, some genres don't play like rules, and they only involve you looking at things, observing them. So in the easy adaptations, your player and your reader experience is going to be very similar because you're basically following along the same path. But a lot of genres involve more hands-off, observing from a distance. And the plot doesn't revolve around them finding that key in that treasure chest up that mountain guarded by that dragon. So let's have a look at what make these interactions possible. And I'm sure, as gamers, I'm sure a lot of you people here are gamers, you can think of lots and lots of ways to interact. Things that involve all the stuff you can do in a video game, like find stuff, use said stuff. Exploring is such a critical part of the video game experience, to find new areas, sometimes because you need to find an item first, like a key, or talk to a certain, shady gnome on the street corner who will point you in the right direction. You will talk. That's the thing. You will talk with people as an interactive thing. And again, Murty, referencing your talk about dialogue, dialogue trees, being able to decide how you want to interact with different characters. Do you want to be mean? Do you want to be nice? Do you want to be wheedling and sideline? You got anything like that? And of course, the big one, if you're playing a video game, is please stay alive, because you can't exactly play if you keep getting nuked by something. And these all involve avoiding problems in the gaming world. So these are all really easy things to take from a video game and plonk gently, with a certain amount of cajoling, into a novel format. And some genres are really good for this one. They are all interactive, immersive. These are your detective crime ones with the mystery. They are the horror, especially survival. Have we got any people here who love survival horror? Yep, a few ones here. They involve an awful lot of doing things, usually under pressure. Westerns, Red Dead Redemption, anybody? Yep. That genre makes a beautiful crossover, that one. Science fiction and fantasy are very good genres in themselves for this, but also they're very good settings. But again, I don't have time today with you to talk about the difference between a setting and a genre, but it's worth looking into. The ones that don't do the crossover so well involve these things, these little buggers. Politics. When was the last time anybody played a game of interactivity that involved you finding the item that would stop somebody doing a particular policy, or going behind somebody's back, or doing something like that? Again, these are hard, not impossible. You're observing lots of human interactions and emotions rather than directly doing something to trigger them. And say, learning life lessons, when you have been poking and prodding stuff, whether it's politics on a grand scale, I'm not just talking like governments here, I'm talking even just political manoeuvrings within even a family. These all involve teaching you something, learning life lessons, very important ones. And of course, jokes. You'd think jokes are interactive, but really jokes are something that you observe happening rather than construct as part of your interactivity. But again, these are hard, not impossible, because there are some that break this mould. And I wonder if anybody's got a particular example in mind that I'm going to bring up in a second. You don't see that many video games that are purely romance, or purely coming of age, or purely comedy, purely politics. They all need something else to hang on to. All of these genres involve looking at stuff that's happening rather than actively interacting with it and making those changes happen on your terms. But there are ones that break the mold. And the way you do that is you transcend the genre. This is something that John Truby talks about in his recent book, which is that thick, called The Anatomy of Genre, which I highly recommend. And the example I'm going to use here, one you might be familiar with, Life is Strange. This is technically a coming of age, but it manages to transcend that genre because it involves elements of the supernatural, of horror, of the more interactive genres. So you go through this coming of age story in a high school via these interactive elements that the base premise by itself would not be able to convey. So it is possible to do. Don't ever tell anybody that this is impossible. It's just hard. And sometimes the fun is in finding out ways to do it. But yeah, include elements from other genres, but you have to be really cautious when you're doing that. Some crossovers really don't work. As Truby spends, 800 odd pages explaining this process in detail. I don't have 800 pages worth of time, so let's move on. I sent earlier, at the very beginning, that I would call, air quotes, main character, the avatar protagonist, rather than the avatar or the protagonist. And this is because in a game, the main character is the player's avatar. It is you. You're at the controls. You're in the driving seat. You're making the decisions. Shoot that person, climb that wall, find that key. But your protagonist, the protagonist is the one who's making the story happen. And sometimes the main character is not actually the protagonist. So I'm going to use that term for now. But regardless of what we call them, they are your audience's entry point into that world that you're creating. They are your guide, your substitute. And as they learn stuff and do stuff, you will learn and do stuff. So sometimes you don't need one. It sounds very daft, but in a video game, you really don't need an avatar protagonist to have a good game. Tetris does not have an avatar protagonist. Yet it's one of the most successful, most ported games, most emulated ever. So when you are creating your video game and you say, oh, I wonder if I can do an avatar, do a novelization of adaptation of this one, do you even need one? Because if you're going to do an adaptation, you will. So if you don't have an avatar protagonist actually in your video game that you're producing right now, can you actually create one for your novel? And that goes into a case study that I'm going to look at here. I'm going to use two examples to show how sometimes you can have your avatar protagonist be a fully realised individual. They have their own personality, and their wants and needs are what drives the plot forward. But likewise, you can have a completely blank slate as your avatar, with almost no information about them, not even a name sometimes. And the examples I'm going to use, you're probably familiar with, is Senua from Hellblade and old friend here, this guy. In the game, Senua has a really incredible personality and backstory, and her story as a fully realised character and individual is what's driving the entire process. That guy in the game, don't need anything. Just call him that guy. He is the true neutral avatar. When you fire up Doom as a game, you know that you're just being put in a big suit with a big gun to shoot things and run like crazy. And that's the fun, that's the purpose. But if you want to novelise it, you've got to give him a bit more to work with. So in this, the authors, David Hugh and Brian Lively, they actually, they gave him a name, Corporal Flynn Taggart, very manly. And they gave him other characters to work off. He has, in the game, obviously, you're by yourself, but in the novels, because that's part 2 of 4, would you believe? In the novel, he has a companion, a fellow Marine called Arlene Sanders. In Hell on Earth, they go to Utah, of all places, when the demons invade, and we get introduced to a whole bunch of people, none of which appears in the game, but is necessary because a novel has a completely different structure and completely different expectations to just plug in, suit up, shoot like buggery. Bit more complicated than that. So you need to be aware of this and decide how you want to do this. Before we come to the conclusion of this one, I just want to ask the elephant in the room. Why do you even have a story in the first place? You know, I've spent ages now talking about story structure and game narratives and why that's different to novels. Why do we even have to go through this trouble at all? You know, when was the last time you saw somebody agonising about this over like Candy Crush? You just don't. So they are important, and I don't mean in a throwaway sense. They are important because they will connect us to that game world, that made-up world, whatever media you decide to do it, in a way that goes way beyond how many guys you can shoot, how many speed runs you can do, how many no bed pack runs, whatever. You will want to stay in that world. That gives you greater replay value. You will not just want to go back to this because I'm bored, so I might as well see if I can push, for another 3 seconds or another 10,000 points or another few pickups. That will give you more replay value. They will give you more depth. This is something I talked about in the advantages. Builds the world building, the lore. It deepens the experience, deepens the world, gives it a more dimension than is possible in a game. And lastly, this is an important one, messages and meaning. Because as writers, I don't care what media you decide to go in, whether you go novels or comics or games, whatever, you will be saying things with your story that align with your worldview, with your values. You might think, what possible values can Doom? Well, if you're a diehard Christian, Doom is a bit difficult to swallow with all the pentagrams and demons and everything. So just be aware that as a writer, you hold enormously influential power over people. Unconscious power is sometimes the most insidious, the most dangerous form of this. Just be aware of it, because you only have to look at things like the Bible to see that a single book, a single story, can have a massive impact. And I'm not choosing that one out of that. That was Alan Moore. He can take full credit for making that comparison. Okay, so I don't know how much time we've got left. Has anybody got a watch?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, right. Okay, so we'll breeze through this, and if anybody's got any questions, we'll see if we can get through them. So, hopefully, this whistle-stop tour will have given you the benefit of understanding some of the... No, I don't want captions and subtitles. You should have a better idea now of the advantages and the disadvantages of deciding to novelise something. You'll need to understand the factors involved in the adaptation process. Everyone else go on. Why some genres are easier and some are harder to make that crossover. The factors you need to consider when choosing your avatar protagonist, whether you have one or not, and what kind of protagonist you want, and why stories are important, why they are the backbone of whatever media. Angel of Darkness came out 20 years ago, and to the world at large, it was a failure because of commercial sales or critical reception. Guess what? 20 years later, it has the biggest fan base in the entire community for Tomb Raider because its story was so intriguing and was so strong. Even broken, even half finished, they'd give us another year to polish it, that would be great. But they didn't have that. And in that broken form, it was inspiring to people. It was inspiring to me. It was inspiring to huge numbers of people in the community. That's the power of stories. And who knows what's going to happen next? Because I don't. So, okay, thank you very much for listening. You have been so attentive. Nobody's fallen asleep, I don't think. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask? Anybody? Yes?
You mentioned earlier about like expanding on different aspects of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously you can't expand on everything, or you have a book a million pages long. How do you choose what to like delve into and expand on?
How do you choose what to delve into? How do you choose what to expand on?
Obvious ones like the first kill, I like taking the move, but like smaller bits, how do you choose it? I need to expand on that and I need to look into it.
One of the best ways to do it is to look at how those moments that were underused or underutilised, look at how they fit into the wider story structure. And that's a very good example because in the game, that moment was basically sabotaged by the demands of gameplay. And that's why it felt so dissonant, that's why it felt so bad. That would be a brilliant time to do it. Excuse me, I've got to sit down. But equally, if you're playing a game and you go, you know what, this character gets mentioned once in a journal that's found by a bloody corpse with monster claw marks in the floorboards, and we know something really shit nasty is going on down here, but we never know what. Well, maybe you could write a novel based on what happened to that person. Spoiler alert, he dies. But when you're wanting to look at things to expand, look at the things that the game wasn't able to or didn't have time to go into, or through the demands of gameplay wasn't able to really explore in a more intimate, more in-depth sort of way. And open that up, see where that little wedge, what that will open up and what avenues will be explored from there. That help you? Anybody else? Oh, yes.
Can you say a bit about intellectual property? What are the issues?
Yeah, very good point.
concerned about?
Very good point. And this intellectual property is, oh God, that's a whole other topic. As a general rule of thumb, game companies don't mind you adapting your stuff, their stuff into stories, as long as you're not profiting off it. So that's why fan fiction is such a massive part of life on the internet. So many people are inspired by what they play or watch that they want to create some more stuff based on that in prose form and share it. It depends on the IP holders. Somebody like Nintendo is famously, infamously jealous about guarding their IP. And if you so much as go outside wearing a red shirt and blue dungarees, you're in trouble with them. Yeah, don't do that. I'm detecting a certain amount of guilt in your smile there, Chris. I hope you haven't tried that.
Not yet.
That's okay. When it comes to, of course, your video game that you are creating, you will still hold all those rights. And if you hire a writer to novelize it, again, please don't take my word as gospel on this one, but there will need to be a contract negotiated to make sure that the rights of that writer, but that franchise are both respected. And again, this is more than I've got scope to answer in more detail here. But yeah, it varies depending on the company and on the individuals involved. But always double check to make sure that you're not stumbling into the arms of some very angry lawyers. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
Pardon me. So, obviously we talk about, the what you do and don't adapt into the game with things like that. However, something that I thought of while you were saying that, there are certain games which have side content that does play into the main story. Assassin's Creed 2 as a prime example of this, where there's an entire chain of side quests that lead to an armor that you canonically get in the next game and things like that. And at the same time, at one time, those are purely sort of gameplay, how do I put this, sort of gameplay sections where it's a story where you have a cutscene of a monk going, they're doing renovations at the start, and then it's Ezio climbs on the beam, Ezio jumps over the beam, Ezio climbs up the thing. But it would be a disservice to not include the reward at the end, because again, it was canon. So how would you sort of handle that?
In a novelisation? That could be woven into the character arc of that individual protagonist, make that armour important to the way that their character evolves and changes. Again, character arcs, we could talk about this, or I could talk about this to an empty room for too many hours to count. But suffice to say, a character can grow from in a positive arc. They start in one place and they end up in a better one. It can be negative, where they do the opposite, or it can be flat. The character themselves doesn't have to change, but they become a catalyst for change around them, in the people around them. I mean, Paddington Bear is a perfect flat arc protagonist. You know, he inspires so many things going on. I'm not trying to compare Paddington Bear and Assassin's Creed in the same conversation, but somehow we've managed it. So yeah, if I was adapting that into a novel, I mean, I've not read any novelizations of it, but my instinct would be to look at the armour and say, okay, how does that symbolically fit into Ezio's journey as a character, going from one person at the very start to the end? What does it show? What does it represent? What has he got to go through to earn it? How does he recognise the significance on it? How does it change his worldview and his view of himself? That kind of thing. Does that help answer the question? Yeah, great. Any more before we finish? One more.
Yeah. What was it when you started becoming, say, a fan that made you? How did you start that journey and get you to actually thinking, I need to write a novel on this story and expand it to that level?
Well, my journey began in 1999 with Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation. That was my first Tomb Raider. I'd ignored the franchise up to that point because I'd only focused on the marketing. Then I actually played a game and discovered, the marketing's rubbish. But then Chronicles and Angel of Darkness came along, and there was this massive gap in the continuity. Lara ends Last Revelation buried under a pyramid, seemingly dead. Sorry, spoilers. And then right at the beginning of Angel of Darkness, she's arguing with her mentor, Von Croy, and getting really bitter about it. You know, Egypt, Werner, you walked away and left me. I'm like, what the hell happened here? How did she get out? And it wouldn't be until like 20 years odd later that Murty canonically explained that story. But way before then, I think in 2006, I'd always loved to write. And I just started writing Lara's escape from the pyramid. That became a novella called An Angel in the Darkness. And it's very passive. It's not, no explosions, no big monsters or anything. It's a very gentle story. But I needed to figure out what happened to Lara to make her into this person. What was it that changed her? A big missing gap. I would even argue that the fact that Angel of Darkness was broken and unfinished on release is what really gets under fans' skin. It triggers the imagination. We want to engage with it in a way that we couldn't if it was all T's crossed, all I's dotted, underlined, done, final. And when I finished writing that novella, I'd enjoyed the process so much I just kept writing short stories. And for some reason, possibly medication, possibly anxiety, possibly insanity, alien mind beams, whatever, I suddenly started, I've got to continue this story. I've got to continue Lara's journey, her evolution into the Angel of Darkness, into these events. And that became the book that's currently sitting over there, and again, is free to download off my website if anybody is bored. And it just carried on from there. I had to write the sequels, and that Path of the Black Alchemist is my third attempt to do it. I did 2 group attempts because other groups of fans wanted to turn it into a playable game. And they said, oh, you can write, you can do the novel version of it. And I'm like, you are wanting to do this in like 6 weeks. I think that's a bit unrealistic. So that eventually became, I can do this on my own solo. I've not got other people's deadlines or any other gameplay dissonance coming into there. But that's where my fan to writer journey began. And I know that there are other writers, professional writers, who started by doing fan fiction. Fan fiction is nothing to sneer at. I mean, fucking Dante's Inferno is biblical fan fiction, for crying out loud. It's been going on a long time, way before Kirk and Spock were a thing. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from as a writer, and hopefully going much further than this. Path of the Black Alchemist, Part 2 of the Angel of Darkness trilogy. That was in July, and I'm currently editing the final book now, and that should hopefully, fingers crossed, touch wood, be done by next year. Organising this and taking part in this has taken a bit of a chunk out of my energy with that. But I'm hoping to have that finished by next year, so there is at least a complete trilogy. Whether it's completely what you think it should have been, Murty, is another thing, so I'm going to... if it's not up to scratch, then he'll turn up at my door with a baseball bat, so I'll know. Yes, thank you very much for coming, everybody.